The candles in the great hall of Aldenmere Park had been burning for 3 hours, and the wax had pooled low in the silver sticks before the document arrived at the table. Lady Cecily Aldenmere had watched it come from the far end, carried on a tray by the family solicitor, Mr. Garvey, with the precise care men reserve for objects that will outlast the room they enter. She had counted the candles, 14, because there was nothing else she could do with her hands, which lay in her lap beneath the white cloth and did not tremble. She was seated below the salt. She had lived in this house for 24 years. She had managed its accounts for 4 of them. The chair she occupied was the one assigned to unmarried daughters of reduced circumstance, to poor cousins, to women who were present but not principal. She had dressed for dinner as she always dressed, in the cream gown she had turned twice, the Spencer jacket in sage green that her maid had pressed to exactness, her dark auburn hair smoothed to the period's propriety with no ornament, save a small tortoise-shell comb. There were no jewels. There had been no jewels for some time, the estate's difficulties being what they were. At the head of the table, her father's hand closed around a pen. At the near end, the Earl of Harwood set his own pen beside his glass and did not yet lift it. She had not looked at him directly. She knew he was watching her. She knew it the way she had known other things about this man in the 4 days since his arrival, which was his quality of stillness, which was different from indifference, and by the slight rearrangement of his attention when she entered any room he occupied. He was here as a witness, he had said. A formality. He had said that word as though it cost him something, and she had not allowed herself to consider why. The deed lay open. Mr. Garvey read the provisions aloud, and Cecily heard the words she had been expecting since the first week of October, when her father had called Phineas Aldenmere down from London, and had not called her. The marquisate, the park, the farms, the income, entailed in special remainder to the male line, to Mr. Phineas Aldenmere of Grosvenor Street, in the event that the current marquis should die without male issue. Her father signed. Phineas signed. The Earl of Harwood did not sign at once. He sat with the pen in his hand and looked at no one in particular, or so it seemed to those watching. He looked, in fact, at the place where Cecily's gaze rested on the middle distance above the centerpiece, and his own expression contained something she did not permit herself to interpret. Then he signed, and the candle nearest the document sputtered once and held. She set her glass down very carefully on the cloth. She had been placed below the salt in her own family's house, and she would leave in the morning. If one wished to understand what had brought the matter to this particular evening in this particular hall, one would have to go back further than the October summons, further even than the autumn 4 years past when the Marquis of Aldenmere's health had first begun its long and patient decline. One would have to go back to the theory of daughters that the Regency had inherited without question, and that Lord Aldenmere had absorbed as a young man, that a daughter was a temporary arrangement, a trust held in custody until the appropriate moment of transfer. Love, in this framework, expressed itself as protection, and protection meant removal from risk, and removal from risk meant removal from consequence, and removal from consequence meant that when the crisis finally arrived, a daughter had no standing in the room where it was decided. Lord Aldenmere loved his daughter in precisely this way. He was not a cruel man. He had been, in his better years, a warm one. He had read to her from the library when she was very small. He had once ridden with her across the south field in the rain, because she had asked him to, and he had not said no, which was unusual in him, and which she had never forgotten. He had declined to bring her into the management of the estate, because he had believed, sincerely, that it would frighten her. He had not asked her whether she was frightened. He had made that decision as he made most decisions about his daughter, from the conviction that he knew her circumstances better than she did, which was a conviction he held about all women, and which had never been tested against the evidence. Cecily had begun keeping the estate accounts in the November of her 20th year, after the steward had retired and her father's health had prevented him from finding a replacement. She had found the account books stacked in the morning room where they had no business being, taken them to the small writing desk in the window of the east corridor, and begun. She had taught herself the system inside a fortnight. She had caught 2 errors in the first 3 months and corrected them without mentioning the matter to her father, who would have been troubled, or to Mr. Garvey, who would have been alarmed in a manner that produced questions rather than solutions. She had written to 3 tenant farmers whose rents were in arrears and had negotiated arrangements with each of them that kept the estate whole and the men in their homes. She had reduced the household expenditure by 17% over 2 years without cutting any position. She had told no one. Her father had accepted the results of these efforts as the natural consequence of a well-ordered household, because he had no framework in which his daughter could be the architect of such order. To him, the estate's improved condition was an act of the estate itself, a machine that had simply resumed its function. When Phineas Aldenmuir arrived in the 2nd week of October, a large and confident man who smelled of London and spoke with the ease of someone who had never been wrong in a room that mattered, he had looked at Cecily across the entrance hall and made his assessment inside the first 10 seconds. "My cousin," he said to the footman who was taking his coat, as though Cecily were an item of furniture requiring identification. "Lady Cecily," said the footman, whose name was James, and who had known her since she was 8. "Yes," Phineas said. "Quite." He turned toward the stairs. "I hope the room is prepared." It was. She had prepared it herself. The dismissive label arrived the following morning, at the breakfast table, in a voice not meant to carry, but carrying nonetheless. Phineas had been speaking to his mother, Lady Forsbrook, who had come down from York with him, and who occupied the house with the settled certainty of someone who had been rehearsing for a role for 30 years. "She has no practical claim, of course," Phineas said, not looking up from his plate. "Merely a daughter." A pause. A pity, naturally. One feels for her. One did not, particularly. One felt very certain of one's own position. Edmund Wentworth, Earl of Harwood, arrived on the Thursday of that week, and the October light was failing into the trees at the western boundary of the park when his carriage came through the gates. Cecily had been returning from the home farm, having gone in the afternoon to speak with the bailiff about the winter feed schedule, and she was crossing the gravel sweep when the carriage door opened. He stepped down without assistance, a tall man in a navy tailcoat who moved with the economy of someone who had long since stopped requiring an audience. He looked at the house first. Then he looked at her. She was carrying the red ledger under one arm. She had meant to return it to the estate office, and had simply not done so yet. "Lady Cecily?" he said. "Lord Harwood," she said. He did not smile, precisely. Something in the planes of his face rearranged themselves in a manner that was not quite neutral, and his gray eyes, pale and attentive beneath a dark brow with a small pale scar at the left cheekbone, took in the ledger with a quality of interest he did not verbalize. "You have been riding?" he said. "Walking," she said. "From the home farm." A pause. He looked at the ledger again, and she had the sensation, which she had not had in some time, of someone seeing what she carried and understanding, without being told, what it was for. "I had understood the stewardship of Aldenmuir to be in some transition." "It has been in some transition for 4 years, she said, and kept her voice entirely level. "But the accounts have not suffered for it." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the quality of that looking, there was something she did not know what to do with, an attention that was specific rather than social. the look of a man who had asked a question and found the answer interesting. "No," he said. "I suppose they have not." "Mr. Phineas has been here a fortnight," she said, and was not certain why she continued, only that the evening air had a sharpness to it, and this man had not treated her as a problem to be positioned around. He will wish to review the accounts himself, naturally. When he does, he will find everything in order. "I do not doubt it," Edmund said. He was still watching her. His gray eyes in the failing October light had a quality that was neither warm nor cold, but something more precise than either. The quality of a man taking a careful measurement, because the measurement will have consequences. "Lady Cecily, will you be remaining at the estate once the papers are signed?" The question landed with unexpected weight. No one had asked her this. Phineas had assumed the answer was no, without troubling to state it. Mr. Garvey had drafted his documents on the same assumption. Her father had not, she thought, considered it. "I expect that will depend," she said, "on Mr. Aldenmuir's intentions for the dower arrangements." He received this without flinching, which was more than most men had managed. "Yes," he said, with an evenness that was entirely different from dismissal. "I expect it will." He took his case from the footman and went inside, and Cecily stood on the gravel for a moment after he had gone, aware of the cold evening air against her cheek, and of the peculiar sensation of having said an honest thing aloud, and been heard by someone who did not appear to find the honesty inconvenient. If you have stayed with this story, you likely feel already what she did not yet know how to name. Stay with it a little longer. The following morning, Cecily rose before 6. She did this every morning. It was not an affectation. The morning hours between 5:30 and 7 were the hours in which she could work without interruption, and the work had always required her whole attention. She went to the small accounting room off the main corridor, which was neither the formal study nor the library, but a plain room with a single window and a table that had once been used for drying flowers and now held the current year's ledgers in 2 stacks. She had been working for perhaps 40 minutes when she found it. Phineas had been through the current account book. The marks were his. She knew his hand by now from the notes he left on the hall table. What he had done, whether in ignorance or in something she did not wish to name, was to transpose 2 figures in the quarterly reckoning, in a way that would, over the course of 12 months, divert a considerable sum from the Farm Improvement Fund into the general accounts, from which it was very easy to make disbursements. The error was subtle. It was the kind of error a man might make without intending to, and it was also the kind of error that, if undetected, would leave 3 tenant farms without the drainage work they had been promised before winter. Cecily sat for a long moment. Then she took her pen and corrected the figures. She restored the sum to its proper column. She noted the correction in the margin in small, precise hand, dated it, and replaced the ledger on the shelf. She did not record the original error. She did not intend to shame anyone. She intended only that the farms should receive what had been promised. She did not know that he had come down the corridor at 20 minutes past 6, looking for the deed of conveyance that Mr. Garvey had said would be in the estate office, and had stopped at the open door of the accounting room. She did not know that he had stood there for some minutes, watching her work in the early light. She did not know that when she replaced the ledger on the shelf and turned to gather her papers, the slight frown at her brows and the steadiness of her hands had produced in him an effect for which he did not immediately have language. He found the document he had come for and returned to his room, and did not mention to anyone what he had seen. He sat for some time at the small writing desk by the window, and did not open the document. The morning had turned bright, a thin October sun coming through the glass and laying a pale stripe across the desk's surface, and he was aware of a quality of unsettlement that was not unpleasant, so much as unfamiliar. The sensation of having one's understanding of a situation revised by a single observed fact. He had come to Aldenmere expecting a routine commission. He had expected, if he was honest, a house in some disorder, the steward gone, the Marquess ill, the heir not yet arrived, and instead he had found the house in meticulous order, the accounts balanced, the tenants apparently at ease, and the source of all this order correcting other men's errors at 6 in the morning in a room without ceremony, without witnesses, and without the slightest indication that she expected anyone to notice. Edmund had not intended to be distracted by this commission. He had accepted it because Lord Aldenmere was an old acquaintance of his father's, and because the legal business was simple, and because he had been in London for 4 consecutive months, and his rooms in Grosvenor Place had begun to feel like something that was merely keeping him. He had not expected the estate to be in the condition it was, which was to say, in excellent condition, quietly and impeccably maintained. He had not expected the condition to have a source. He walked in the portrait gallery on the second evening after dinner because he found Phineas Aldenmere's company trying, and Lady Forsbrook's company worse, and because the gallery was in the east wing, and thus unlikely to contain either of them. The portraits watched him as he walked, generations of Aldenmere men, each with the dark brows and strong line of jaw that appeared again in the small face of Lady Cecily, though in her it had resolved itself into something finer. He stopped in front of a portrait of a woman in white, painted perhaps 40 years past, who had the same auburn hair and the same quality of self-possession that did not require the room's acknowledgement. He stood there a long time. He had not looked at portraits with any particular feeling since Eleanor died. He had spent the year after her death becoming someone who did not permit himself particular feeling about anything, because the alternative was to sit with what he had not done during the months of her last pregnancy, the work he had chosen over her, the evenings he had returned home after she was asleep and left before she woke. He had not been unkind. He had been absent. He had told himself, as a young man and then as a grieving one, that presence would have changed nothing. He was not certain he had ever believed it. The miniature of Eleanor was in his breast pocket. It had been there for 3 years. He touched it occasionally without being aware that he was doing so, the way one tongues a sore place to confirm it is still there. He was touching it now. He took his hand away and looked at the portrait of the auburn-haired woman in white, and thought about a red ledger corrected at 6 in the morning in a plain room with a single window, and went to bed. The formal dinner was on the Friday, and the house was full. Mr. Garvey had brought 2 associates. Lady Forsbrook had produced 2 cousins and a family friend from York, a Mrs. Dawlish, who had kind eyes and who watched Cecily throughout the meal with an expression Cecily did not examine. Phineas was in excellent spirits. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of a man trying on a coat and finding it fits, and he spoke well and generously about his intentions for the estate, most of which were sound in outline and none of which reflected any particular knowledge of the estate's current condition. Edmund sat midway down the table and said very little. Cecily had the seat below the salt, between Mrs. Dawlish and one of Mr. Garvey's associates, which was not a seat she had ever been assigned in her own house before Phineas's arrival. She sat in it, with her spine entirely straight, and her hands folded in her lap when she was not eating, and she did not permit her expression to say anything at all. Lady Forsbrook, addressing Mr. Garvey with the warmth of shared understanding, said, near the end of the first course, "She has done what she could, of course, given the limitations of her position. One cannot expect more of merely a daughter." Mr. Garvey nodded in the manner of a man who did not disagree, but did not wish to be on record agreeing. Lady Cecily's contribution to the household has been commendable, he said, which was the kind of sentence that meant nothing and was designed to mean nothing. The deed arrived at the table at 8:30. Cecily watched it come. She knew the figures in that document better than the man who had drafted them. She had balanced the accounts it referenced for 4 years. She had written to the tenant farmers, whose names appeared in its annexes. She had reduced the debts whose amounts it cited. She had done all of this because someone needed to do it. And her father was ill, and she was here, and she knew how. And none of that would ever appear in any document this house produced. Her father signed. His hand shook only a little. He did not look at her. Phineas signed with the confidence of a man concluding a transaction he had always known was in his favor. He picked up his pen. He held it. Something crossed his face that was not quite readiness. He looked down the table at Cecily, who met his gaze with perfect evenness for 1 full second. And then she looked away, because she had the dignity not to ask for anything, and the self-knowledge to understand that she was on the verge of doing so. He signed. She set her glass down. The sound of it, the quiet, precise click of crystal on cloth, was the only sound she made for the remainder of the evening. The table continued its conversation around her, Phineas receiving the congratulations of Mr. Garvey's associates, and Lady Forsbrook presiding at the far end with the settled satisfaction of a woman whose plan had arrived at its correct destination. No one looked at Cecily. She had been seated below the salt, and those seated below the salt were furniture, and furniture was looked through rather than at. She ate the remainder of her dinner. She held her expression in the way she had learned to hold it over 4 years, which was to say with the muscles precisely where her face required them, and her attention focused on a point in the middle distance that was neither accusatory nor bereft. She did not permit her hands to shake. She would leave in the morning. She had already composed the letter in her mind. She had not composed it in her mind for the purpose of saving herself. Herself was already past saving by the instrument that had just been signed, and she was clear-eyed enough to understand that what was done in law was done, and that weeping about it in either private or public would accomplish precisely nothing of use. She had composed the letter for the tenant farms, Phineas's correction of the accounting figures, or rather his undoing of her correction, which she had found when she returned to the accounting room on Thursday afternoon, had confirmed what she had been trying not to know. The farms would not receive the drainage work, that by February the lower field would be standing in water, that the Hartley family, who had been on that land for 30 years, would petition for relief before spring. She could not stop the deed. She could write a letter. The letter was addressed to Mr. Clifton of the County Commission, who was a fair man, and who she believed would act on documented evidence without requiring her to be present to advocate for it. She had set out, in careful language, the accounting irregularity she had observed, with dates and figure references. She had attached a page from her own personal copies of the estate records, which she had maintained for 3 years in her own hand, against exactly this kind of circumstance, without knowing she was doing so against exactly this kind of circumstance. She had signed it with her full name and her father's title, which was still hers to use for the present, and she had sealed it. She intended to give it to James to post in the morning, before she called for her boxes. What she did not expect was that he should be in the corridor outside her door at 6:30 in the morning, nor that he should be waiting there in a manner that suggested he had been there for some time. She stopped. The letter was in her hand. He looked at it. He did not ask what it was. "I know what you intend," he said, "and I would like to tell you something before you do it." "Lord Harwood," she said, "the post goes at 7. "It will go at 7, he said. "I will not prevent you. I am asking for 10 minutes. She looked at him. He was in his traveling coat, which meant he had also intended to leave this morning, and the sight of that, for reasons she refused to examine, produced something in her chest that was uncomfortably close to relief. She stepped back from the door. 10 minutes, she said. He told her what he had seen in the accounting room at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning. He told it plainly, without embellishment, in the manner of a man reporting a thing he had observed, and that he now considered himself bound by having observed. He told her what he had concluded, which was that she had been managing the Aldenmere estate for 4 years to a standard that the new heir was already demonstrably incapable of matching, and that the deed he had witnessed the night previous was, in his professional judgment, a document that benefited no one with any real interest in the estate's welfare. "You witnessed it," she said when he had finished. "I did." "Then it stands." "The deed stands," he said. He met her gaze, and in the gray morning light, his own face was still and entirely without the performance of certainty, which was itself a kind of honesty she was not accustomed to in men of his rank. "There are also provisions in the Aldenmere settlement that your father's solicitor, Mr. Garvey, will not have found it in his interest to surface. I am familiar with them. Your grandfather's original settlement included an alternate conveyance clause. It requires demonstration that the named heir is actively impairing the estate, not merely incompetent, actively impairing." She held the letter tighter. "That is why you want the 10 minutes. I want the 10 minutes, he said, so that you understand what is about to happen, and so that you may choose whether to permit it." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she was aware of the exact distance between them. 3 feet, perhaps less, and of the quality of his attention, which had not wavered from her face since she had appeared in the corridor. She had been looked at as a problem to be managed, as a pity, as a complication, as a daughter, and nothing more. She was not being looked at in any of those ways now. "What will you do?" she said. "If I permit it?" "I will go downstairs," he said, "and I will speak to your father. And then I will speak to Phineas Aldenmere in the great hall, where there are enough people present to constitute sufficient witness. And I will demonstrate what your letter was written to demonstrate, with the additional provision that makes the deed contestable. And then I will ask Mr. Garvey to send for the county solicitor." "You came here to witness a deed for a man who has been your father's acquaintance," she said. "This will make an enemy of the family." "I have had enemies," he said. "I have also, more than once, stood by while a document I did not believe in was completed, because I believed it was not my place to say otherwise. I am no longer certain that position has served anyone particularly well." She held his gaze. The miniature was in his breast pocket. She could see the slight outline of it through the wool. She did not know what it was. She knew only that whatever it contained had some bearing on the way he stood in front of her now, without the armature of rank or professional remove. "Go downstairs," she said. He went. The great hall of Aldenmere Park held, on a Friday morning in late October, the Marquis of Aldenmere in a bath chair by the east window, Mr. Garvey and his 2 associates at the long table with their papers, Lady Forsbrook and Mrs. Dawlish at the fireplace, 3 house servants clearing the remnants of the breakfast things, and Phineas Aldenmere himself, who was standing at the mantelpiece, reviewing what appeared to be a letter from his London bank, and who looked up with moderate surprise when Lord Harwood entered, and more considerable surprise when Cecily entered behind him. "Lady Cecily," Phineas said, and the words carried the tone of a man encountering an inconvenient piece of furniture that had moved itself. "I had thought you were packing." "She is not packing," Edmund said. The room became very still. Edmund sat down on the long table, with the unhurried precision of a man depositing a document he has been carrying for some time, a sheaf of papers. He addressed Mr. Garvey first, briefly, citing the settlement provision by its clause number and date in a voice that was level and entirely without heat. He then produced, from his case, a copy of the accounting record correction, dated Thursday the 6th, with Cecily's initialing in the margin. He laid beside it a paper of his own, which was a brief legal instrument he had drafted, apparently, at some point, between the signing of the deed and this present morning. Phineas began to say something. Edmund looked at him. Aldenmuir's heir, Edmund said, is in this room. I have the document. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Lady Forsbrook made a sound. Phineas went, by degrees, very still. The Marquis, by the window, had turned his face from the light and was looking at his daughter, and the expression he wore was one Cecily had not seen on him in 4 years, which was to say the expression of a man who had believed one thing for a long time, and had just discovered, at considerable cost, that he had been wrong. Mr. Garvey went for his papers with the efficiency of a man who understood that his position depended on his being useful to whoever held power, and who had just recalculated where that power resided. Cecily stood in the center of the room and did not permit herself to tremble, though her hands, which she had kept still through so much of the preceding week, were less steady than she would have liked. She was not triumphant. She was, very quietly, undone by the experience of being named correctly in her own house, and she set her teeth against the feeling, and kept her posture. Edmund was beside her then. He had not crossed the room with any great ceremony. He had simply turned from the table, and she was standing where she was, and the 3 feet between them closed to 6 inches, as naturally as if no other arrangement had ever been intended. The letter, he said, quietly. Just to her. She looked down at it in her hand. Mr. Clifton will still want to know about the drainage. He will, Edmund said. I will take it to him myself, with your permission. She considered him. You came here for 3 days, she said. You have already stayed 9. I find, he said, and something crossed his face that was very nearly the expression she had once glimpsed in his gray eyes at the dining table, the one she had refused to interpret, that the commission has been more complex than I was led to expect. I do not object to the complexity. A pause. Particularly. She allowed herself to look at him directly, fully, which she had been careful not to do more than twice since his arrival, and what she found in his face was not the managed blankness of professional courtesy, but something far more specific and far less governed than that, a quality of wanting that he was not, in this moment, at any great pains to conceal. Lord Harwood, she said. Cecily, he said, her name in his voice, her given name, which no man in this house had used in 4 years, landed in the quiet of the room as a thing distinct from all the other sounds, as though it had been waiting for this particular morning to be spoken. She did not say anything. She gave him the letter. He held it with the same steadiness with which she had held the ledger, and the great hall of Aldenmuir Park settled around them both with the slow inevitability of a room recognizing, at last, who belonged in it. The weeks that followed were, by the standards of the Regency autumn, uneventful. Phineas Aldenmuir withdrew to London. Lady Forsbrook followed, but not before a single exchange with Cecily in the morning room in which she said very little, and understood from Cecily's composed and unmoved expression that she had been in the presence of someone she had gravely underestimated. She did not say this aloud. She smoothed her gloves and she left. And if there was in her departure a quality of recalculation, It was at least the beginning of an honest one. Mr. Clifton received the letter. The drainage work was approved before Christmas. Lord Aldenmere, in the remaining weeks of his life, called his daughter to him on 3 separate mornings. The conversations were not long. He was not a man who found apology natural, and she was not a woman who required it. What passed between them was something quieter, and perhaps more lasting. An acknowledgement that love had been present all along, and had been badly translated. He died in December, peacefully, with her hand in his, and the winter light coming through the east window of his room, and she kept the red ledger on the desk in the estate office that was now, by the provision Edmund had brought to the hall, entirely hers. Edmund stayed through November. He told her about Eleanor one evening near the end of the month. In the portrait gallery, standing before the auburn-haired woman in white. He did not offer the telling as a confession or as a bid for sympathy, but as a fact he had been carrying alone for 3 years, and which it seemed right, in the presence of this woman in this house, to carry differently. He told her about the work he had chosen over Eleanor's last months, about the evenings he had been absent, about the child who had not survived, about the 3 years of telling himself that presence would have changed nothing while touching the miniature in his pocket, with the unconscious persistence of a man who did not entirely believe himself. Cecily listened. When he had finished, she said, "You were wrong to be absent. You cannot know that it would have changed anything. Both things are true, and neither one cancels the other." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I suppose they do not." "You have been punishing yourself," she said, "by declining to want anything." "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "You have been very thorough about it." The thing that crossed his face then was not quite a smile, but contained the bones of one, and it was, she thought, the most honest expression she had seen on him in the full month of his company, which had contained many honest things. He asked her to marry him on the first Saturday of December, in the estate office, in the presence of no one at all, which was exactly the right number of witnesses for the particular asking. He did not make a speech. He stood in front of her and said that he had come to Aldenmere to witness a document and had instead found that he was entirely unable to leave, and that the reason for this, while he had been reluctant to name it for longer than was perhaps sensible, was sitting in front of him, and deserved to know. She said yes without hesitation, which startled him, and then she looked at the slight motion of surprise on his face and said, "Did you think I would consider it?" "I thought," he said, "you might have reservations." "I have many reservations about a great many things," she said. "I have none about this." He crossed the small space between the desk and the chair where she sat and took her hands in his, both of them, and stood there for a moment, simply holding them. And the quality of that holding, the steadiness of it, the complete lack of performance or strategy, was the thing she would return to in later years, when she tried to find the right word for what she had understood about this man, and when she had understood it. He bent and pressed his lips to her brow, which was chaste and unhurried and certain, and she closed her eyes for a moment and let the morning have it. They were married in the village church at Aldenmere in February, in the snow. It was a small ceremony. James the footman, Mrs. Dawlish, who had written to ask if she might attend and had been welcomed with genuine warmth, the bailiff from the home farm and his wife, the vicar, and 3 of the tenant farmers whose fields had received the drainage before Christmas. Phineas Aldenmere was not present. Lady Forsbrook sent a card. The county, which had been observing developments at Aldenmere Park since October, with the keen interest counties bring to bear on inheritance disputes, drew its own conclusions, and for the most part approved of them, because the estate under Cecily's management was in better condition than it had been in a decade, and this was apparent to anyone who cared to look. Edmund had an estate of his own in Warwickshire, which was well managed, and which they would visit in the spring. In the meantime, the library at Aldenmere Park became, by quiet mutual agreement, the room where they spent their evenings. It was warm. It had 4 windows that faced west and caught the last of the afternoon light, and it smelled of leather and old paper, which was, Edmund said, the smell of rooms that had been used well. On the evening of the 3rd day after the wedding, Cecily placed the red accounting ledger on the library desk. She had not intended it to be a ceremony. She had simply carried it in from the estate office because she needed to verify a figure, and she had set it on the desk, and then she had stood there for a moment, looking at it with the particular feeling of a woman putting down something she has carried for a very long time. Edmund came in from the far end of the room, where he had been going through a shelf, and stopped when he saw it. "The estate accounts," he said. "The estate accounts," she said. He came to the desk and sat beside her, which was not a formal arrangement, but the natural consequence of there being a chair beside her, and him being someone who, when given the choice, had consistently chosen proximity. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You would like to verify a figure?" he said. "I would," she said. "Show me," he said. She opened the ledger and showed him. He followed the column with one finger and found the figure and confirmed it, which was not something she had needed him to do. But the warmth of the shoulder beside hers as he bent over the page was its own kind of answer to a question she had been asking for 4 years, without realizing she was asking it. Outside the library windows, the snow had begun again, quiet and unhurried, settling over the south field and the home farm, and the bare trees at the estate's boundary in the particular way of February snow that makes everything look like the first morning of something. She turned the page, and he stayed.